Welcome to Sultana Sessions, Episode 3. Our topic tonight is Bay Science 101. My name is John Mann. I'm the director of the Lawrence Wetlands Preserve here at Sultana Education Foundation in Chestertown, Maryland. Tonight, we kind of envision this as being a night to go through some of the key concepts you're going to hear when people talk about the sciences around the Chesapeake Bay. And maybe these are ideas and topics you've heard before, maybe they're new to you, but it's always kind of helpful to go back and have a refresher just to bring ourselves up to speed so that when you're hearing a news story or when you're talking with a friend and you hear terms like watershed or salinity thrown out, you kind of have a better understanding of what exactly they're talking about. So the Chesapeake Bay is an estuary, okay? An estuary is a really cool place in nature. It's kind of where a river and an ocean meet. So it's this in-between transition area. And the Chesapeake Bay is a huge one. It's about 200 miles from the head of the bay to its mouth, okay? We at Sultana in the past year, we took some time and really beefed up our online resources because that's been the primary way that we've been interacting with the public throughout the pandemic, is either talking to you live like we are on the computer right now, or setting up a segment of our website called sultanaclassroom.org. And on that, you'll find all sorts of resources about the history or the science of the bay. So what I thought would be helpful for tonight is from time to time, I can just take us through a bit of that website and we'll talk about the topics that are contained within there. Okay, so I'm going to pull up that page for you right now and show you what I'm talking about. So again, you can, hopefully it's an easy name to remember, sultanaclassroom.org. You can also get to it on our main website. And if you go into here and check out Chesapeake Bay ecology, you'll find all sorts of topics. And the first one probably to start with is the first one on our list, watershed. Watershed's a word you're going to hear all the time, and it's a big word, and it might seem a little complicated, but it's really not that hard to figure out. So when we say watershed, here's a analogy I like to use to help students is if you take your hands and kind of make a cup with them, okay, and then you imagine your hands to be the topography of the Chesapeake Bay. If I filled my hands with water, it's all going to head right down to the middle, right? Because that's the low point, all right? And the earth works the same way. If there's a mountain, it's going to shed the water in one direction. So a watershed is really just a collection of where there's a common set of river and streams that all empty into the same body. And in this case, we're talking about emptying into the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is this huge landscape. It's actually, when we talk about the bay, you really need to include the watershed, and there's 14 times more land than water in the watershed. And why does that matter? Well, what happens on the land is going to have a huge impact on the water. So let me show you a map here of the watershed, and then we can get into it a bit more. So I found this really great map that was designed by a group called choosecleanwater.org, and I really like this because it highlights all the streams and the rivers in the bay, which sometimes when you look at a map of the bay, you're going to see the bay, you're going to see the major rivers, but all those little side creeks might not jump out to you, and those are hugely important. Okay, so here we go. They've done that I like is they've highlighted just the Chesapeake Bay watershed is in color. So you can see it is a huge area. It contains parts of 6 states. So if we start up in the north, and I'll actually zoom in a bit. If we start up in the north in New York, it's really upstate New York, like Cooperstown. If you think of where the Baseball Hall of Fame is, that's part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. All those creeks and streams and rivers there are eventually going to connect to, most likely to the Susquehanna River, which flows right down through Pennsylvania. Again, look at all this blue in here. It's all interconnected down through Pennsylvania into Maryland. We've got a little bit of Delaware. Come over to the west, you can see West Virginia. You can see Virginia. Of course, District of Columbia is right in there. And it spans both the eastern and western shore of the bay. So we think of the eastern shore as being pretty flat. There is, believe it or not, there are some hills on the eastern shore. And so right in Delaware, there's going to be this dividing line where if a raindrop falls on that dividing line, it's either going to be funneled to the west towards the Chesapeake Bay, or it's going to be funneled to the east towards the Delaware Bay. And if I'll zoom out a bit again, if we go over to the west of us, of course, we have the Appalachian Mountains, okay? And what you're looking at here is basically the ridgeline of the Appalachian Mountains. And again, rain that falls on those mountains is either going to be funneled to the east towards the Chesapeake Bay, or if it's going to the west, it's probably going to end up in the Mississippi River watershed. So again, watershed's a big word, but it's something that's all around you. And a great example of a watershed you can find at home is after it rains. Springtime's a great time for rain, right? So after it rains, go out to your sidewalk, go out to your driveway. And if you see where little puddles have collected, that's a low point, right? The land has shed that water into there. And if you've got an oil slick in your driveway, probably some oil's gathered in there. So we can point out and illustrate to people how, depending on what's going on the land, is eventually going to make its way into the water. A lot of communities too, you can, if you go to the storm drains, they might have painted the Chesapeake Bay starts here, or the Chester River starts here, because they're really trying to drive home to people that idea that just because your house isn't right on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay, you still impact it, you're still part of the watershed. Okay, so if we go back to our website here, Sultana Classroom, we're going to jump into our next topic. So let me pull that up for you. So now the next question is, we kind of know where water comes from. What type of water are we talking about? So you can see this next tab, salinity. Okay, salinity, how much salt is in the water. And you can see we've got some videos here from my cool colleagues, Mr. Chris and Ms. Beth. We've got some little downloadable PDFs. We have additional links you can click on from other organizations outside of Sultana, like NASA, maybe pertinent YouTube videos, and other groups that are connected. So we know that this is a resource that a lot of classroom teachers have told us that they've been using, but we're also hoping that, you know, just the public at large might check out that website, because it's got, I mean, I'm biased, but it's got a lot of good stuff for you if you're interested in salinity. So most of us have heard of saltwater, right? If you've been to the ocean, you've gone swimming, maybe you've tasted some, but very few of us probably understand how much salt is in that water, right? If we were to measure it, how much salt makes salt water? And when I throw out that question to people, they say, oh, it's 50-50, right? It's half salt, half fresh water. Well, it's not that much. It's actually way less, but people sometimes guess that because our tongues are very sensitive to salt. And that makes sense as we've evolved to teach us not to drink water with salt in it, right? It makes you very sick. So salt water actually only has about 3.5%, or if you want to round that up, you could call it 35 parts per thousand salt molecules. Okay, so 30,000. So in theory, if you took the time and took 1,000 beach buckets to the ocean with you, fill up with water, and set them out in the sun to evaporate, the salt would be left over in those buckets, right? And if you consolidated all that salt, you'd be left with 35 buckets of salt out of 1,000. Not a lot. Okay, to illustrate that, we've got this nice little visual device here of 1,000 beads. Okay, most of them are blue, representing our freshwater molecules, and 35 of them are white, representing our salt molecules. So you can kind of see there's not a ton of salt in the ocean, but it makes a huge impact. Now, if we were to compare that to a lake or a mountain stream where we have fresh water, so what does it mean to be fresh? It means there's no salt. Okay, it doesn't always mean, freshwater doesn't always mean I want to drink it or it's clean. In this case, fresh just means zero salt. So same idea. This one was a little bit easier to put together. 1,000 blue beads equals fresh water. 0 ppt, 0 parts per thousand. That's another term you might hear thrown around, ppt, and that's all that means. I joke that scientists don't like to use decimal points. So instead of saying 3.5%, they say 35 parts per thousand. Now, if you remember our watershed, again, use your little hand analogy. And now that you've seen that blue map, you could imagine that all the creases on your hands, all the wrinkles, all the lines of your fingerprints are rivers and streams, right? So when they're all flowing down towards the bay, that's fresh water, right? That fresh water is coming off the land. Either it's in the mountaintops as the snow has melted, or like I mentioned, it's springtime, we're getting a lot of rain, or underground springs where they come to the surface. All that water gets funneled down, right? Water wants to reach sea level, so it's gonna keep moving. As long as it's elevated, it's gonna keep moving down until it reaches sea level. Now, with an estuary, we mentioned it's where rivers and the ocean kind of intermingle. So what happens in the ocean? Well, again, if you've ever gone to the beach, you've seen this happen. There's tides, right? Tide comes in, tide goes out. About every 6 hours, the tide's either moving in one direction or the next. So what that means, when the tide's coming into the bay from the ocean, okay, so down by Virginia, like Norfolk, we're getting 6 hours of 35 parts per thousand water rushing into the Chesapeake, all right? And so when that mixes up, that salt and that fresh, we get a new type of water called brackish. It's a great word, all right? Here's another little learning device I like to teach students. Hold out one hand, you call it salt. Your next hand is fresh. Together, they're brackish, all right? Things like this just help me remember what I'm talking about. So brackish water is actually the rarest stuff on Earth. About 97% of the world's water is salt, about 3% is fresh, and brackish is like just a point in that. It's not even a whole percent. But it's an amazing thing in nature because really unique things can happen when you get that intermingling, get that mixture. So let me show you a chart here because, all right, great. How long is this guy gonna talk to us about salt? It's kind of boring. I get it, but it really impacts all that really neat stuff in the water. All right, so if we want to talk about the critters that live in there, you better believe they care about the salt level. So one of our printouts on that on our website there is showing different salinity levels that different species will prefer. So you can see our little chart at the bottom showing no salt on one end or fresh water and salt water on the other end or 35 ppt. And then anywhere in the middle is brackish, okay? So brackish isn't just one solid number. It can be 1, it can be 34, it can be anything in between. And if you look at different species, like a largemouth bass, you can see it mostly likes fresh water. Our catfish can go a little bit more brackish, but still on the lower range. But if you go down to the bottom to something like the rockfish, it can go all over. You can find rockfish in the Atlantic Ocean. You can find them way high upriver, especially when they're spawning in fresh water. Something like a shark is really going to be confined to more salty waters. Yes, a sandbar shark could come into the mouth of the bay, but they're not really going to venture much further than that because they need at least 25 parts per thousand. All right. So salt levels will also change at different times of the year, right? Which might seem weird, but actually the more you think about it, that makes sense. Because it's all about that mixture, right? If I'm adding more fresh water into the mixture, like times of year when the snow's melting and it's raining a lot, right now, the spring, the entire bay gets a bit fresher because we're getting, those mountain streams are like white water right now. They're raging waters coming into the bay. Now, you take the opposite of that. Let's think about like August and September, where maybe we haven't had rain for a few weeks. That snow's not there to melt anymore. The white water's not the raging, it might be a trickle now, but the tide's still doing its same thing every day. It's coming in and out, okay? So you're getting less of this and the same of this. That means the entire bay the brackish level goes up, it gets a little bit saltier, right? And so you see different things at different times of year. We're in Chestertown, we're pretty far north on the bay, and really it's not until late summer, early fall that the crabbing gets really good here. And that's because crabs will migrate with, here I've got a little crab here for you, right? And you can see our crab can go pretty much all over. They'll go as low as 1, and they'll definitely, you can find them in the ocean, but they prefer a little bit more salt, especially the females. So they're gonna migrate south for the winter, bury themselves down in the mud, and then as things warm up, they'll start migrating a bit, and especially later in the summer when the whole bay gets a little bit saltier, they'll migrate some more. Let's look at something like an oyster, okay? And oysters want at least 10 parts per thousand, okay? So when we look at things like oyster aquaculture, which is the farming of oysters, there are certain places where they find more success than others. And if you can reliably find 20, 25 parts per thousand salt, you're gonna have a better chance of your oysters surviving. So this is another thing that's interesting. If you remember 2 episodes ago when Mr. Chris was talking to you about Captain John Smith's bay map, the entire bay was saltier back then, right? So think about that for a beat. Why, 400 years ago, was the bay saltier, right? If I'm telling you that it's because of tide and it's because of rain, right? Those things haven't changed that much in 400 years. But if we go back to the idea of watershed, the land around the water, has that changed in 400 years? Absolutely, right? Remember the images of all the trees on the map and the Native American villages, right? All those trees do a really good job of capturing that water as it runs off the land, right? They have these tremendous root systems that are absorbing the water. So even though it was raining relatively the same amount, not as much of that water ever reached the bay. So they found that the entire bay was quite a bit saltier, and that meant historically you could find things like oysters in places where they just couldn't survive nowadays. So I think the salinity, the brackishness of the bay is fascinating because you can look at it from a historic perspective, an ecological perspective, a seasonal perspective. If you're a fisherman, you're going to want to pay attention to these things because it's going to impact what might be living in the water. And I brought one of those things with me because I'm here in our Holt Education Center where we have a tremendous resource, our wet lab, and I caught one of our fish here. So this, if I can show it to you, is a bluegill sunfish, okay? You might hear them called sunnies, and they really don't like a lot of salt in their water. Their range, we call it between 0 and 3 parts per thousand. So you're gonna find them high upriver where there's a lot of freshwater grasses growing. So a lot of freshwater fish too. You might see, I'll show you a picture of this one because it stays still for me. A lot of them might have stripes on them because that's, if you picture like what a pond ecosystem looks like or high upriver, you're gonna find, hopefully if it's healthy, a lot of grasses. So that's nice camouflage. Our sunfish also some cool things going on with it. Look at that spiky, bony dorsal fin stand, right? So if you've ever tried to pick up one of these fish the wrong way, you quickly learn what that thing does. That's defense, right? Those are like thorns going into your fingers, and it might make a person drop it. It might make a bird drop it. So you got all kinds of defense going on here. We've got the coloring, we've got the spines, of course we've got the scales, and this fish in this cup of water, if we talk about types of water, right? This is fresh water. I took it out of a freshwater aquarium. Could this fish live in here forever? No, because another thing that healthy water needs is oxygen, right? Dissolved oxygen. So in our aquarium, we have a little machine that bubbles, right? It keeps oxygen from our air dissolved into the water. Obviously, we don't have bubble machines in our rivers. So what keeps oxygen in that water for the fish? Well, hopefully, like I if it's a healthy body of water, we're going to have plants. And so just like outside for us, there are trees and bushes putting oxygen in the air for us. Those submerged grasses, a lot of times people call it seaweed. We like to call them SAVs, submerged aquatic vegetation, right? Sometimes they get a bad rap because people are like, oh, my propeller got stuck in them. But if you see water with lots of submerged aquatic vegetation, that's great for this fish because it's giving it oxygen so it can breathe. It's giving it habitat to hide in. It's maybe giving it, helping hold the bottom of the water together, the sand or the mud, keeping that in place, giving something for this fish to attach its eggs to, right? So that's our bluegill sunfish. Yeah, it's calmed down quite a bit. Oh, I got a good question here from Anita Tyler. Does the depletion of SAVs also affect the salinity level? So I don't know that the SAVs will directly impact the salinity level, but the next thing that I'm going to get into is turbidity, all right, which is how cloudy the water is, and certainly it'll impact that because one of the main things those SAVs do is they help hold things in place, right? So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but that's a great question. Let me bring up our website once again so we can go into our next topic. Okay, so here we are back on sultanaclassroom.org. I'm going to be disappointed if we don't get a ton of hits on this thing. So here, I got into dissolved oxygen a little bit. I'm not going to go into that tab right now, but that's something you could check out later on. Tonight, I'm not going to get huge into nitrogen and the pH of the water. Those are definitely worthwhile topics. The next thing I wanted to jump into was this tab we're calling water quality or Secchi Disc. Okay, so again, there's a great video here. Chris filmed this last year, and you can see some PDFs, some other resources. Whenever we teach about turbidity, how cloudy the water is, we usually use one of these. This thing's called a Secchi Disc. We've got this great company right here in Chestertown called Lamont, and they make scientific testing equipment that's actually used all over the world. So of course we support their stuff. You could support their stuff and buy from them. You could also make something like this at home, or you can do the weighed-in test, right? And I'll explain in just a minute how this works. So we've got black and white colors, right? So we've got half of that is going to absorb sunlight, the other half is going to reflect it. It needs a weight so it doesn't float, right? You're just going to find a body of water that you want to test, and you're going to lower it in until it disappears. Okay, in just a minute, I'll play Chris's video where he did that at the Chester River. But like I said, you could also walk into the water and look at your feet and stop walking when you can't see your feet anymore. And then you can take a measurement and you'll know how turbid or how cloudy the water is. Right, so we'll let Chris do the talking here for a bit. I'm going to pull up his video. Here we go.
Hey, it's Chris Serino from the Sultana Education Foundation, and today I'm going to be conducting a very simple experiment to measure how far light can travel down into this body of water where we are today, the Chester River, here in Chestertown, Maryland. To do this, I'm going to use a really simple tool. It's called a Secchi Disc. This was invented by a gentleman in Italy with the last name of Secchi. It's S-E-C-C-H-I. It's pretty simple. It's a round plastic disc with 4 quadrants. You can see 2 of the quadrants are white, 2 of them are black. And what that does is when I lower this into the water, we'll be able to see these really clearly. And so to do this, I'm simply going to lower this rope down and lower the disc into the water. And you'll see about every 18 inches or so, there's a mark on this line, and that'll tell us when the disc disappears. So again, I'm going to lower this into the water. We're going to watch it real carefully and stop it when we can't see it any longer. So here we go. You'll notice the river is not clear. There's a lot of suspended sediments in the river here. There may be some algae growth. All right, so I've gone about maybe half a foot. You can still see the disc. You can still see it. And right about there, it disappears from view. So I'm going to pull that up and mark it. And it looks like today our Secchi depth is about 16 inches. So the last question is, who cares? Why would I want to know that the light disappears?
All right, I'm going to stop Chris there. If you want to find out the rest of, Chris's spiel of why you should care, you can watch his video, but I'm going to go into that a little bit now too. And also what affects that, right? So there's stuff in the water giving it color. There is plankton living in there, right? There's algae. There could be sediments after a big rainstorm. Hopefully there's not things like motor oil, but there could be other foreign substances in there that could also affect it. And why does that matter? It kind of creates, it can have this like carpeting effect where it blocks out the sunlight. So in John Smith's day, we always go back to John Smith because he kind of gave us the ecological baseline, right? He observed this area at a time when it was least impacted by humans. There were about 100,000 Native Americans. This is all an estimate. There were about 100,000 Native American people living in the Bay watershed 400 years ago. And now there's upwards of 18.5 million, right? And also, like we talked about, deforestation, parking lots, things. Not only are there a lot more of us, but we're living with a much higher carbon footprint than people were 400 years ago. So when John Smith came through this area, he said he could see 60 feet to the bottom. I don't even think I have that much rope to do a Secchi Disc test 400 years ago. Nowadays, if I can like walk in and I'm waist deep and see my feet, I consider that to be a pretty good sign, right? Like 3 feet. And so what's changed to impact that? Well, we're gonna go high tech. We're gonna use the whiteboard here, okay? Let's imagine, I'm gonna draw upside down, so bear with me. This is like a cutout of the land with the water, okay? And we mentioned in a healthy body of water, we should have grasses, right? Maybe there's some oysters, a few fish swimming around, all right? Maybe a little crab down at the bottom, right? We're making this like an idealized Chesapeake Bay. Maybe here's a great blue heron over here, right? If I had more time, I'd flesh that out a little bit more, but you guys get the idea. So now there are also plankton living in the water, right? These tiny little things that are actually really important because they feed the baby fish, right? So you need plankton. When I say plankton are in the water, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. But if you get, by the way, plankton love nutrients, right? They love things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, okay? So if you put more of that in there, you're gonna have more plankton. Well, you told me plankton are good. They feed baby fish. So let's make some more plankton, right? What could put more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium? Well, maybe my car, right? I drove here tonight. This is a terrible car, but it's like a Dr. Seuss car. Bear with me. All right, there's my car, right? I don't have a fancy EV car. I'm putting exhaust into the air. Maybe there's like a neighborhood with some houses, right? Maybe there's a parking lot, right? So we're getting things going up in the air, we're getting things coming off the land, and those things, again, this is Bay Science 101, so we're just gonna say things for now. Those things are putting nutrients into the bay, right? And as you put nutrients into the bay, you feed the plankton. Woohoo! Plankton love it, they're exploding. Plankton. And what that means, sometimes you can see this in places like if you see a pond just covered in duckweed, that's a really good illustration of what's going on. Is the sunlight now can't really penetrate that. It's almost like a carpet on the water, right? And so the sunlight, if it can't reach the bottom, you can't have your grasses grow down there. Maybe the sunlight only goes a little bit, so you have a few grasses. But if you can't have your grasses, you're gonna have less fish, right? less places for the crabs to hide. So really that has a huge impact on all of this. Oh, and the oysters, remember? We over-harvested the oysters. We ate almost all of them. There's like less than 1% of all the oysters that were here when John Smith came through. You know what oysters are really great at doing? We call them filter feeders. So they draw in water and they eat plankton, and then they release water without plankton. Okay? Maybe you've seen that experiment before where you can take river water, fill up an aquarium, put oysters in there, give them about 30 minutes or so, and the oysters will have basically made it clear water. So more of us doing more stuff, less of oysters doing their good stuff. These things have combined to be a big problem for the bay. The number one problem facing the Chesapeake Bay, over-nutrification, right? And so what do we do about that? Well, maybe we could do less of that stuff on the land. Like I mentioned earlier, there are really exciting programs going on with Oyster Aquaculture, where farmers are growing oysters in these floating tanks. And the really neat thing about it is it's making money for the farmers, right? So they'll probably keep doing it. And it's cleaning up the water in those areas. So it's a big issue. We're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of it tonight, but those are just some of the ideas there. All right, I'm going to finish up with a fun little experiment here. We go back to, I promised you some science experiments. So here's one that if you want, you could replicate this at home, okay? We filled up 2 jugs of water, and one of them we put salt in, and one of them we did not, and we put in food coloring. Now, Captain Aaron set this up for me ahead of time because he was here earlier, and he did not tell me which was salt and which was fresh, all right? He said he was gonna leave it to me to figure out. So I did the old-fashioned salinity test, okay, where I took my finger, dipped it in there. I can taste the salt in there. It's dramatic, right? Sometimes I do that when I'm out paddling. Just dip it in, get a little sample, and it'll kind of tell you, is this a lot of salt? Is it not a lot? So what are we gonna do? I've got this container here, and it's got a divider in the middle, right? I always wanted to be a magician. This is like sawing the assistant in half, except we're gonna saw the water in half. So let's go ahead and fill these up here. Try not to make a mess. All right, so if you remember, we've got our salt, we've got our fresh. You probably don't have one of these at home, but you can easily use table salt and food coloring and just some kind of mixing container. But what's really cool about this, if we do it right, we'll go ahead and remove the wall. Ha ha ha, Captain Aaron, I got it right. Now, how do I know I got it right? Because the purple water, the salt water, is heavier because it has salt in it. It's more dense, so it's settling down to the bottom. The fresh water is staying at the top. This is a phenomenon known as a salt wedge. Okay? So when I talked about salt levels being different seasonally, you also get this when tidal changes are happening, right? When you have a big incoming tide, that more dense water can be found even in the water column. You can find higher levels of salinity at the bottom of the river than you'll find at the top. So again, salt and fresh mixing together. So now we have brackish water. I just want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in. I hope you enjoyed this program tonight. We will be back at it again in 2 weeks, where it's going to be Chris Serino taking the microphone, and he's going to be leading you through one of the newest additions to our building here. The second floor of our building is what we're calling the first contact classroom. So it's been set up with really unique and detailed exhibits showing aspects of Native American life. So it's a combination of reproduced objects as well as found objects that were actually used hundreds or in some cases thousands of years ago by Native Americans. So if you're enjoying these programs, I hope you'll spread the word, get some people to check them out. We archive them on our YouTube channel. So you can go onto YouTube and just search for Sultana Education Foundation. And as long as you guys keep tuning in, we'll keep cranking out the content. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in just about 2 weeks.